looking back at the beginning, it was a very modest beginning. I bought a motorbike in Kampala and drove across Uganda into Congo. And there I met with a ranger I knew well, Atama Madrandele, who had worked with me for many years in Garamba. And together we started a very small project. We didn't have any funding at the time. We gradually built it up and took it from there. And although it was the mountain gorillas that inspired me to go to Virunga, it was during those early days when I started to forge a relationship with Virunga's rangers, who at the time, you have to remember this was at the height of the Second Civil War in 2001. They had no uniforms, they had no shoes, there were no vehicles in that area of the park, and many of them had actually been killed during those early years of the war. They hadn't just been killed, they'd been tortured, there'd been public executions because they represented the state. And yet these rangers were still there, and at the time they had nothing. There was a little bit of support that was coming from a few NGOs, notably WWF, but it was very bleak. But they kept the work going, and that's something that that's always stayed at the back of my mind. And in fact, that's the main thing that kept us going in Virunga, was this incredible commitment on the part of these Congolese rangers. And then there was 2007. The early years were defined by an attempt to retrain, to rebuild this corps of rangers. And we felt we were going somewhere. And then in 2007, these terrible events that were so widely reported, when we lost 9 of the gorillas. And it felt then that we were at a loss. We were losing the mountain gorillas. It was the end of a species. And for a conservationist, it's a very traumatic period. It's a very difficult thing to face. And we went through a period of very, very deep concern for the future of the park. And it was at that point that I realized that we had, as a conservationist, I had to do more than sit on the sidelines and provide support. We had to be part of this effort, be part of this corps of rangers that were on the front line. And it was through that I had the incredible privilege of being nominated as their commanding officer, as the chief warden for Virunga National Park. But there was a lot that I didn't know, there was a lot that I didn't understand, and most importantly of which were the political dynamics. And I think it's right and appropriate that our previous speaker was talking about the importance of diplomacy, because we had to redefine our role. Our background as biologists and anthropologists was inadequate for the reality of the situation that we were dealing with. And so what very quickly emerged was that there were these armies that were forming, and these were not national armies, they were irregulars, they were militias. And these militias were very concerned about the park, of course for all the wrong reasons. The park has a great wealth of resources, and these militias need to survive, they need money, they want money. And so they were drawing on these resources. Because it's a national park, it's illegal, and so the situation was ripe for the illegal armed groups. And here we have the very poignant example of the charcoal. Charcoal may not seem like much, but it's a massive industry in North Kivu. It represents more than the turnover from the mineral industry in that province. It has a turnover of about $35 million a year. Because it's illegal, it's extremely attractive to the armed militias, who can get a lot of money from that. And what we discovered was that this was, like so many things, everything is connected in eastern Congo. And if the gorillas were being killed, it was directly tied to this illegal extraction of natural resources by the armed groups who were wanting to access the forest. They couldn't access the forest because it was gorilla habitat, and the rangers were protecting that habitat for the sake of the guerrillas. And so the easiest way for the militias to stop that happening was to kill the guerrillas. And that's what we were finding. And so what we had to do was to address this issue head on, and that's what brought us much closer to the population. The main threat for the park was equally the greatest threat to the human population living around the park. And what we found was that this park was an incredible magnet for these militias. There are close to a dozen armed groups who were living in or around the park, close to 2,000 armed militias living in the park. And of course, on top of all that, what we're seeing is armed militias who are there for the wealth that comes from the natural resources. On top of that, we find that an oil concession had been established, and so the promise of a lot of money. And so I leave it to you to deduce the impact that would have on the political dynamics of the region and the impact on the park, but of course the impact on security and on the welfare of the local populations. And of course there was this build-up of tension, and then what we saw last year was the beginning of this terrible war, yet one more war for Virunga and for the populations of North Kivu. What it meant for us was that we had to organize the evacuations of staff's families. All the rangers, all the uniformed staff would continue their work at a great cost. They took the brunt of this war. All the hardships of the people of Eastern Congo were shared by the staff of Virunga. And we lost a great many of our colleagues during this time, a lot of our friends. So 130 of our rangers have died since the beginning of the war in 1996. 18 have died in the last 2 years. And so it's something that we're continually having to confront.